Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to take a purely analytical, deep dive into a highly debated thesis regarding modern anti-Semitism as put forward by historian and commentator Davis Hanson. We'll be breaking down his core arguments and examining the historical and contemporary comparisons he uses to make his case. Our goal here is to neutrally explore the architecture of his argument, allowing you to clearly understand the framework of his perspective.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here's our roadmap for today. Defining selective outrage, a hypothetical U.S. comparison, global atrocities and silence, criticisms of U.S. politicians, and finally, campus protests and hypocrisy. All right, Section 1, Defining Selective Outrage, the core thesis. So Hanson argues that the absolute best indicator of true anti-Semitism today isn't necessarily overt, right-in-your-face prejudice. Instead, it's a very specific kind of hypocrisy. He calls it selective outrage. Basically, this is when immense, singular anger is directed at one party, in this case Israel, for a specific action, while there's just total, deafening silence when similar, or honestly vastly worse actions are committed by others around the globe. Now, to be totally clear here, Hanson completely acknowledges that criticizing Israeli policy is entirely legitimate, fair game, but he draws a super sharp line when that criticism morphs into conspiracy. For example, he points out that claiming a tiny nation of just 10 million people somehow dictates terms to 340 million Americans, or that a small cabal runs entire industries. Well, that crosses the line from legitimate debate straight into deeply worrisome historical anti-Semitic tropes. To really anchor this idea of selective outrage, Hanson repeatedly comes back to this one piercing rhetorical question regarding October 7th. What were they supposed to do? He lays out the sheer brutality of that day: 1,200 Israelis killed, 251 hostages dragged into this massive underground labyrinth of tunnels right beneath civilian infrastructure. Faced with a totally unprecedented attack like that, Hanson is asking, what would any nation placed in those exact shoes realistically be expected to do in response?
Moving on to Section 2, a hypothetical U.S. comparison, scaling the tragedy.
And this brilliantly illustrates his point. Hanson scales the tragedy up just to help an American audience really grasp the sheer magnitude of it. Because the U.S. is roughly 34 times larger than Israel, he scales the October 7th numbers by that exact multiplier. So, in American terms, that would literally be like a hostile force, let's say Mexican cartels, crossing the border, butchering 40,000 Americans, and dragging 8,000 hostages back across the border. Hanson poses the question, in that horrific scenario, would Americans be demanding our government negotiate with cartel leaders over in Geneva, or would the public demand immediate, overwhelming military action? And, he doesn't just leave this as some hypothetical. He actually grounds it in real history. Think back to 1917, when Pancho Villa crossed into New Mexico and killed 17 Americans. Just 17. In response, the U.S. literally sent 100,000 troops to the border and launched a full-scale military expedition into Mexico. But Hanson points out the wild selective memory today, noting that recently, a former Mexican president actually went out and publicly praised Pancho Villa as this heroic anti-imperialist figure. Okay, Section 3, Global Atrocities and Silence, Historical Precedents. Here, Hanson catalogs some incredibly sobering data points on international silence. For instance, he notes that between 1917 and 1921, Turkey ethnically cleansed 1.2 million Armenians. Yet today, the U.S. provides them with hundreds of millions in military aid. Or take Azerbaijan. Recently, they ethnically cleansed 120,000 Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh. This happened almost exactly around the same time as October 7th, but zero campus protests. Nothing. He even goes back to the early 20th century to the French massacre and beheading of 400 Islamic scholars in Chad. Again, total historical silence. Hanson uses these stark comparisons to spotlight what he sees as just a glaring, massive double standard in global outrage. Then Hanson brings up this staggering number, 900,000. According to his historical analysis, following the 1967 war, Arab nations, we're talking Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, ethnically cleansed 900,000 Jews from their territories. So much so that today, there are virtually no Jewish populations left anywhere in the broader Arab world. Now, what's really interesting about this is how Hanson contrasts that massive expulsion with the demographics inside Israel itself. While 900,000 Jews were pushed out of surrounding nations, the Arab population within Israel's borders has actually exploded. From about 150,000 who remained in 1948, that demographic has multiplied by 14 times. They now number 2.1 million Arab citizens of Israel today. So Hanson argues that labeling Israel an ethnic cleanser is just factually contradicted by this massive population growth, especially when you compare it side by side with the actual ethnic cleansing of Jews from those neighboring states. Let's move into Section 4, Criticisms of U.S. Politicians, Personal Hypocrisies. In this section, Hanson takes a strictly forensic look at Representative Ilhan Omar, analyzing what he sees as a pretty profound paradox. Now, Omar has been highly critical of Israel, calling it an illegitimate entity, and claiming Israeli money influences U.S. politicians. But Hanson points out something interesting. Her own family was part of the elite class tied to Siad Barre's Marxist dictatorship back in Somalia. That's a regime historically responsible for ethnically cleansing up to 200,000 Somalis. Hanson's argument here is that her intense, singular focus on Israel, while holding that specific family political history, is literally a textbook example of the selective outrage he equates with modern anti-Semitism. He applies that exact same forensic lens to Zoran Mamdani, another politician who strongly criticizes Israel as a settler colonial power. Hanson looks at Mamdani's own family history of immigrating to Uganda. In Uganda, Indian immigrants make up a tiny 1% of the population, yet they control an estimated 65% of the nation's wealth. Now, to be clear, Hanson isn't criticizing the economic success of those immigrants at all. What he is pointing out is the sheer hypocrisy of someone from that exact demographic background labeling Israelis, who actually have a 3,500-year historical connection to the land, as illegitimate settler colonialists. All right, which brings us to Section 5, Campus Protests and Hypocrisy, the Contemporary Phenomenon.
Let's see how this builds into Hanson's view of modern university protests. He basically breaks down the grueling mechanics of urban combat in Gaza to explain his immense frustration. Step 1. Hamas deliberately embeds its tunnels and military operations right beneath schools, mosques, and hospitals. Step 2. To actually recover hostages and neutralize the threat, Israel is literally forced to enter these densely packed areas, which means civilian casualties are tragically an inevitable, built-in intent of the Hamas strategy. Step 3, rather than acknowledging this brutal tactical reality, or even offering a viable alternative to get those hostages back, American campuses just erupted in singular, furious protests, directed entirely 100% at Israel. And to really hammer home his point about how selective these campus protests are, Hanson points to this number right here, 40,000. That is the number of mostly Muslim Iranians who were recently butchered by their own government. And during that massive slaughter, American campuses, professors, Middle Eastern studies programs, total silence. Not a single protest from the political left regarding the deaths of 40,000 Iranians. Hanson uses this to show a razor-sharp contrast with the immense outrage directed at a tiny country of just 10 million people.
So, what does this all mean? Well, Victor Davis Hanson's thesis forces us to sit back and ask a really uncomfortable question. Is modern anti-Semitism best understood not just as explicit old-school hatred, but as selective outrage and hypocrisy? By structuring his whole argument around these historical parallels, demographic realities, and comparative global reactions, he's really inviting us to critically analyze why the international community reacts exactly the way it does. We hope this explainer gives you a really clear, neutral look at the architecture of his argument, so you have the context to analyze these global political dynamics for yourself. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive.